Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In the middle of winter, when large snowflakes are falling, the queen of one of the countries in the farthest corners of the earth sat spinning in her window. The window frame was made of luxurious black ebony, and while she was contemplating the snowfall, she pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood flowed over the ice. The queen contemplated the red drops that splashed over the white snow, got lost in thought, and then said, "I wish my little daughter would be as white as snow, as red as blood, as black as a window frame." And indeed the little girl grew up, her skin became as white as snow, her cheeks were as pink as blood, her hair was as black as ebony, and she was called Snow White. But the queen died, and soon the king married another woman who became the new queen, and she was very beautiful, but she could not bear the idea that there would be someone more beautiful than her. She had a magic crystal, she used to go to it and stare at it saying, "Tell me, magic crystal, tell me the truth. Among the women of the world, who is the most beautiful woman, tell me," and the crystal always answers, "You, queen, are the most beautiful in the world." But Snow White began to grow more beautiful, and when she was 7 years old, her beauty was as dazzling as the sunshine, and she became more beautiful than the queen herself. The magic crystal answered the queen one day when she went to stare at her as usual, and she said, "You, beautiful queen, delight the beholders. But Snow White surpasses you beautifully." When the queen heard this speech, her face turned pale from an excess of anger and malice, and she called out to one of her servants, saying, "Take Snow White away into the depths of the vast forest, I don't want to see her again." The servant took Snow White away, but softened his heart with Snow White's entreaties to release her, and said, "I will not hurt you, beautiful child." Then he left her alone in the forest, and he thought that wild animals would probably kill her, and he felt that he had taken a heavy load off his shoulders after deciding not to kill her and leaving her to face her fate. Maybe someone would find her and save her. Poor Snow White wandered through the forest and fear filled her. Wild animals roared around her, but none of them hurt her. In the evening, she arrived at a hut among the hills, and went in to rest, as she was feeling very weak and could not walk. Everything was neat and tidy inside the hut. Above the table, there was a white tablecloth, 7 small plates, 7 small loaves, 7 small glasses with wine, 7 knives and forks were placed in order, and next to the wall there were 7 beds. Feeling very hungry, she ate a small piece of each loaf, took a sip from each glass, and then, thinking to stretch out and rest, tried all the little beds. One of them was too long, another was too short, and finally the 7th bed was the one that suited her, so she stretched out on top of it, and fell asleep. After that the owners of the hut came. They were 7 dwarfs living among the mountains, digging for gold. They lit the 7 lamps, and immediately realized that something was wrong. The first said, "Who sat on top of my chair?" The second said, "Who ate from my plate?" And the third said, "Who ate from my loaf?" And the fourth said, "Who messed with my spoon?" And the fifth said, "Who messed with my fork?" And the sixth said, "Who used my knife?" And the 7th said, "Who drank from my glass?" Then the first one looked around and said, "Who slept on top of my bed?" So the other dwarfs ran towards him, and each one of them shouted that someone had fallen asleep on his bed, but the 7th dwarf saw Snow White, and called to his brothers to come and see it. They shouted in wonder and amazement and brought their lamps to look at it, and each of them said, "Oh my God, what a beautiful baby she is." They were very pleased to see her, and they acted carefully not to wake her up, and the 7th dwarf slept for an hour with each of the 6 dwarfs in succession until daylight broke. In the morning, Snow White told them her story, and they took pity on her, and told her that she could stay with them to tidy the house, cook, wash and spin, and they would take good care of her. After that, they went out to work all day in search of gold and silver in the mountains, and Snow White became alone at home. The 7 dwarfs warned her, saying, "Soon the queen will know where you are, so be careful, and don't let anyone in." The queen thought that she had become the most beautiful woman of the earth after she thought that Snow White was dead, and she went to her magic crystal, said, "Tell me, magic crystal, tell me the truth. Among the women of the world, who is the most beautiful woman, tell me." The crystal answered her, "You, the queen of the most beautiful women on this earth." but among the hills, in the green forest, where the 7 dwarfs live, hiding Snow White. And she is much prettier than you, Queen. The Queen panicked, because she knows that the magic crystal always tells the truth, and she made sure that the servant betrayed her. She could not bear to think that there was someone more beautiful than her on earth. She dressed up as an old peddler, and made her way towards the hills to where the 7 dwarfs lived. Knocking on the door of the hut, she shouted, "I have beautiful things for sale." She looked Snow White out the window, and said, "Hello, good woman. What are you carrying with you?" She said, "I have beautiful goods. I have wonderful goods with me. I have laces and bobbins of all colors with me." Snow White thought to herself as she was going to open the door, "I'll let her in, she looks like a good woman." The old woman said, "Oh, my God. The corset of your dress is not well tied." Snow White did not expect betrayal, so she stood in front of the old woman, who took hold of the corset of the dress, tightly tightened the dress, until Snow White stopped breathing, collapsed to the ground and died. The spiteful queen said, "This is the end of your beauty." Then she returned to her palace. In the evening, the 7 dwarfs returned home, and they were saddened to see Snow White lying above the ground, as if she had died. But they lifted her off the floor, and when they found out the cause of her malaise, they cut the ligaments, and after a moment she began to breathe, and she quickly regained consciousness. They said to her, "That old woman is the same as the queen. Be careful next time, and don't let anyone in when we're outside." When the queen returned home, she went straight to her magic crystal, and she said as she used to, but her biggest shock was when the crystal said, "You, the queen of the most beautiful women on this earth. But among the hills, in the green forest, where the 7 dwarfs live, hiding Snow White. And she is much prettier than you, Queen." The blood ran in her veins, and she felt spite and malice after realizing that Snow White was still alive. She dressed again, but it was different from her clothes the previous time, and she took a poisoned comb with her. When she got to the dwarf's hut, she knocked on the door, shouted, "I have wonderful goods with me." But Snow White said, "I dare not open the door to anyone." And the queen said, "Just look at the wonderful combs I carry." And she gave her the poisoned comb. The comb looked beautiful. Snow White took it from her and put it in her hair to try it, but as soon as the comb touched her head until she fell unconscious, the poison was very strong. The queen said, "I got rid of you." Then she returned to her palace. Fortunately for Snow White, the 7 dwarfs returned early that day, and when they saw her lying on the ground, they realized what had happened, and soon found the poisoned comb. When they took it off her head, she woke up and told them what had happened. They warned her again and forbade her to open the door to anyone. Meanwhile, the queen went to her magic crystal, and she rose up angrily when she heard the same answer as before, and said, "You will die, Snow White, even if it costs me my life." Then she went to her room, brought a poisoned apple with her. From the outside the apple looked ripe and tempting, but whoever tastes it dies on the spot. Disguised as a country woman, the queen traveled through the hills until she reached the hut of the 7 dwarfs, and then knocked on the door. She looked at Snow White from the window, and said, "I'm not allowed to let anyone in here, the dwarfs forbade me to do that." The old woman said, "As you wish, but anyway take this apple, I'll give it to you." Snow White said, "No, I'm afraid so." The old man replied, "Silly girl, what are you afraid of? Do you think she's poisoned? Come on. You'll eat half of it and I'll eat the other half." Half of the apple was poisoned and the other half was not poisoned. The pink apple seduced the Snow White and she wanted to taste it very much. The apple looked beautiful, and when she saw the old woman eating it, she couldn't wait any longer. But as soon as I took a bite out of her, she fell to the ground, the paradox of life. The queen said, "This time you will not find someone to save you." Then she returned to her palace to look at her crystal. Finally the crystal told her, "You, Queen, are the most beautiful women of the earth." The queen's mind finally calmed down and she was overwhelmed with happiness. When evening came, the dwarfs returned home, and they found Snow White lying above the ground not breathing. They feared that she was already dead. They picked her up from the floor, combed her hair, washed her face, but to no avail, the little girl looked dead. So they put her on top of a coffin, and they watched her moan for 3 days. Then they thought about burying her, but her cheeks were still pink, her face had not changed color. They said, "We will never bury her."